I still love about mind mapping so much is that you get this nice visual overview of the topic, and it's very easy to grasp the whole picture. It doesn't really matter whether you use pen or paper or a tool to assist you. It's that overview which is the big advantage for me. And mind mapping was actually introduced in the UK by the British psychologist Tony BUZAN, and here's what he has to say about it. A mind map is a visual and graphic holistic thinking tool. So it's visual and it's graphical. It's not something where you would think about that visually impaired or blind users would be interested in using it, right? At least I could have never imagined that someone who is blind would actually wanted to use our tool, would actually wanted to use mind mapping. Until last year. It was a regular working day. I came into the office in the morning, made a cup of coffee, and then I sat in front of my computer and started to browse through my email. And nothing really special was in there until I stumbled upon an email by Jessica. Hi, I'm a visually impaired user of Apple products, and I'm wondering if your app works with VoiceOver. My first reaction was, why? Why would she want to use mind mapping as a visually impaired user? I couldn't really understand it. Here's her answer. I'd like to write an autobiography and need a place to write down my ideas and construct chapters. So this sounds like a perfectly normal use case, right? Write down your ideas and construct chapters, just as I did when I was planning this talk. So this got me interested, but at the same time I was still curious about how this should work. But I started to mail back and forth with Jessica, and at some point something interesting happened. I got convinced that mind mapping was just as useful for her as it was for me. And the best of all, Jessica agreed to help us improve the accessibility support in our app. So she jumped on our test flight team and gave us feedback on our accessibility implementation. And this is what brings me here today. Hi, I'm Matthias, and I work on MindNode for iOS, macOS, and watchOS. Are there any MindNode users in here by any chance? Yeah, a couple, that's great. But this is not a talk about mind mapping or MindNode, it is a talk about accessibility. So it's actually the other way around. I've given this talk on other more iOS-centric conferences, but here it's a more diverse group of people, which is great. So who in here is not a user of Apple products? Anyone? Okay, a few. Bear with me. This talk is focused on iOS, but still everything I'm going to say is just as much applicable to other platforms as well as Android or Windows or whatever your preferred platform is. So I can imagine that there are different groups of people in here. Some of you probably might have never actually thought about making your app accessible, just as I hadn't until I stumbled upon that email from Jessica. Others might have probably already toyed around with the idea of making your app accessible, probably even toyed around with some framework, but there just was never enough time, or it just, to be honest, wasn't the highest priority probably to make your app accessible. And some in here might have already made their apps fully accessible. So can I have a quick show of hands who has already used accessibility APIs on any platform? Quite a lot, that's cool, all right. So regardless which group you belong to, I think there should be something for you in this talk. But let's start with the most important question. Why is it that we should actually care? There are several reasons why we should add accessibility support to apps. The first one is it's pretty easy. You can get the basics done in just a few hours. And I guess most developers in here have invested several hours in getting an animation timing just right or getting a certain feature just right. So why not invest a few hours in making our apps accessible as well? So with that, we increase our user base. According to the WHO, there are currently 289 million visually impaired users worldwide, out of which 39 million are completely blind. At the same time, adding accessibility support doubles down in UI testing. You can use your accessibility identifiers in your UI tests. And I talked to a friend just today, this morning, and he said that he realized over time that if someone struggles to make their app UI testable, it's because they don't have a suitable structure for accessibility as well. So those two things go hand in hand. If you add accessibility to your app, it's much more easy to make, it makes your app testable, and it's much more easy to test your app as well. Apple itself is very dedicated on accessibility. It's very important to them to make their devices, to make their software accessible to everyone. So it might even increase your chance of getting featured on the App Store, or probably of getting bought, just as Workflow got bought a few months ago. I'm sure this acquisition of Workflow by Apple wasn't about accessibility, but Workflow actually got an Apple Design Award for their outstanding use of accessibility, so it might have played a role in there. Those are all valid and good reasons, but there's one reason which is even more important, which is the main reason, because it is the right thing to do. Think about it that way. Like, we live in a day and age where we as developers have the unique chance to improve the lives of millions of people out there. And isn't that kind of amazing? It's something that's so easy to forget if we fighting the tools, fighting some framework, and are struggling with our work, but it's such a unique chance. And I think we should use it, and we shouldn't only see it as a chance, we should see it as our responsibility and obligation. Because in the end, our goal should be to provide an equal experience for all of our users. I mean, for us, as developers or designers, it's important to have a smartphone, right? It's important to be able to use certain apps. But in the end, most of the time, it just boils down to convenience, whether we can use a certain app or not. For people with disabilities, it can be downright life-changing when they are able to use your app, because it gives them empowerment and independence, and it enables them to do tasks that they simply weren't able to do before on their own. Think about smart home technologies, like, for example, Philips Hue or other smart home technologies. I love mine. They wake me up in the morning. I can conveniently turn them off from bed, but overall, it's just a gimmick. That's about it for me. So you might think, why would someone who is blind need lights at all, right? A friend of mine, who's actually in here today, she went to a workshop a couple of months ago with a blind instructor. And he told them his story there. So he has friends visiting from time to time. And as we all might know, sighted people do feel quite a bit more comfortable when they actually can see something. So obviously he has lights in his home, and he turns his lights on when they come visit. So they sit together, they enjoy the evening, enjoy a glass of wine, and at some point his friends leave again. So if you leave someone else's house, would you turn off the lights? Probably not, right? It feels kind of weird to leave someone back alone in the dark. But how is this blind instructor supposed to know whether the lights are still on or not? He can't see them. So what he had to do in the past is he actually had to climb up and touch the light bulb to see whether it's still hot or not, so that he knows whether the light is still on or not. Nowadays, he can just say, "Hey Siri, turn off my lights." It's quite a difference. There are a lot of myths about accessibility out there, so let's look at some of them, break them down, and contrast them with reality. There's myth number one, that all visually impaired users are blind. We somehow seem to assume the most extreme case, but in reality, there's an entire spectrum, starting from corrective lenses up to complete blindness. And it's pretty clear that all of these different groups of people have different needs. So people that are partially sighted have very different needs than completely blind users, and it's important to keep that in mind when we add accessibility supports to our apps. There's myth number two, that visually impaired users access things sequentially, one step after the other. That's actually kind of blew me away when I first sat down with Jessica, because I was expecting the whole process to be very slow. I was expecting the whole process to be cumbersome, her usage of the iPhone to be very slow. But it was completely different. She had an incredible memory of location, and she used it just as we did. I mean, it makes sense, right? Once you know where the button to compose a new message in the Mail app, for example, is, you don't search the whole screen for that button, you go straight to that button. And it's the same for visually impaired and blind users. They use the memory of location to be just as efficient as we are. Then there's myth number three, that visually impaired users listen to all on-screen text. That's actually a lesson that you learn pretty quickly if you sit down with someone. They listen to just enough to orient themselves. So we're going to go into this, into more detail on this a little bit later, but the accessibility label is the first thing that gets read out to the user if he focuses on an element. So it's very important that the accessibility label is very descriptive and very short, because it's all about efficiency. They don't want to read a book, they want to use your app as efficient as possible. In fact, it's possible to change the speed of the text that's spoken out to you. And when I first sat down with Jessica, I wasn't able to understand anything because she had it at the highest speed, as experienced voiceover users usually do. And it's at 100%, it sounds like this.
Hi folks, you're having a good time? I'm so sorry you have to find out that way, but we are out of coffee. Please don't blame the messenger.
So, did you understand it? Maybe try it again.
Hi folks, you're having a good time? I'm so sorry you have to find out that way, but we are out of coffee. Please don't blame the messenger.
So that's 100%. In contrast, that's how it sounds like with 55%. It's like the speed that I usually use when I use VoiceOver.
Hi folks, you're having a good time? I'm so sorry you have to find out that way, but we are out of coffee. Please don't blame the messenger.
So there's a wide range of accessibility technologies out there, just as there's a wide range of disabilities out there. Starting with the simplest things like localization, right-to-left language support for languages like Arabic, dynamic type, which allows you to adjust the font size to the preference of your users, bold text to make text stand out even more, reduced motion for people with motion sickness, reduced transparency, and so forth. Lots of different technologies to assist people with different needs, and it's very important to take care of all the different needs. For today, though, we're going to focus on VoiceOver, and I'm sure most in here know what VoiceOver is. It's Apple's screen readers technology. There are similar technologies on other platforms like TalkBack on Android, which are more or less the same. So a screen reader technology is all about turning your whole device into an input area, and it reads out what's under your finger. So the user can just pan around the screen, and this is how they know what's on the screen and which controls are actually there. So do you all have your iOS devices with you? At least the ones that have them. Take them out, and I'm going to show you the quickest way to enable VoiceOver on your device. So head into the Settings app, and then go into General, and then Accessibility. And once you're there, scroll down all the way to the bottom, and there you should find an entry called Accessibility Shortcut. So if you tap on that, you'll get a list of different options. And give it a try and enable VoiceOver there. So what this does now, VoiceOver is always just a triple click on your home button away. So wherever you are on your iOS device, if you have enabled this shortcut, you can simply triple click on the home button to turn on VoiceOver. So give it a try. And you can turn it off just as easily with another triple click on the home button. Okay. If you are successful, it's good. So put the devices away for now. There will be time to play with it later. First, I'm going to walk you through the most important gestures that we need to know if you want to use a device with VoiceOver enabled. The most simple gesture that you can have is a simple tap. In contrast to when you use your device normally, this single tap simply changes the focus. So this black rectangle that you might have seen earlier, which is called the VoiceOver cursor, is the focus of the current element, currently selected element. And if you tap somewhere on screen, it changes the focus to this element, and VoiceOver reads out the accessibility label and other properties of that element. You can think about it as a keyboard focus, for example, where you can change the focus with the arrow keys. It's similar to this. So that's a single tap. To be more efficient, you don't need to tap everywhere on screen. You can also just pan around the screen, and VoiceOver will change the focus and read out what's under your finger. So if you now actually want to interact with the control, as if you would normally tap it, you need another gesture, a double tap. So double tap on screen now activates the control that's currently focused. What usually happens if a sighted user first tries to use a device with VoiceOver enabled is that he or she tries to double tap within that black rectangle, within the VoiceOver cursor. But that's actually not needed, fortunately. So you can double tap anywhere on screen, and VoiceOver will activate the currently focused element. That's a double tap, another gesture. Another handy gesture is to change the focus sequentially. So if you simply swipe to the left or to the right, you can change the cursor from one element to the next or to the previous one. That's handy if you want to explore a screen and want to explore all the elements that are on screen accessible by VoiceOver. So usually, if you have a standard UI, it's pretty clear on how the focus should be changed, because we as developers have the possibility to change the order of elements. And if you have a normal table view, a collection view, or something like this, you probably just want to move it from one cell to the next. But it gets a little bit more complicated if you have a different structure. Imagine, for example, a two-dimensional canvas with mind maps, nodes, branches, connections on it. You need to find a way to put this two-dimensional structure into a one-dimensional structure that actually makes sense to go through sequentially. A lot of apps have one most important action. Like, for example, in the phone app, it would be to take an incoming call. In the music app, it would be to play or pause music playback. In the camera app, it would be to take a picture. So if your app has something like this as well, you can implement a simple gesture which is called the magic tap. So the user can then double tap with 2 fingers anywhere in the app to trigger that action, which is pretty neat to trigger your most important action in the app. All right, so now that we know the most important gestures on how to use a device with VoiceOver enabled, let's look how MindNode performs in action.
MindNode. Pizza list. Alert. Rename document. Button. Dismiss pop-up. Pizza list. Button. Button. Search field. Is editing. Character mode. Kako heads meeting. Today. Select. MN documents icon. But. Kako heads meeting. Kako heads meeting. Kako heads meeting. Board. Kako heads meeting. Text field. MN documents icon. MN mind maps. MN document source icon. Button. Need support? Need support?
So that wasn't very glorious, right? That was the state of accessibility in MindNode before we actually started to work on accessibility support. So let's see how we can improve things from here. And in the Apple world, on iOS, this is with UIAccessibility. This is the framework that Apple provides us as developers to add accessibility information to our app. And this information is then used by different technologies like VoiceOver and other assistive technologies to help users with disabilities use your app. And at the heart of UI accessibility is an informal protocol on NS object with different properties that you can specify for your elements. For example, accessibility label. This is probably the most boring property you'll find. It's just a simple string. But at the same time, it's also the most important one that we have. Because it's what you use to describe your UI element to the users. And if you remember myth number 3, that visually impaired users don't listen to all on-screen text, it becomes pretty clear why this is so important. The accessibility label is what gets read out first if you focus on an element. So it needs to be short and descriptive of what the element actually is, what it actually does. Most of your accessibility labels in your app should be a single word, at most 2 probably. So if you have a button to create a new document, you can simply call it create. If it isn't really clear from the context that it would create a document, you can call it create document as well, but not any longer than this. So there are other rules as well. You shouldn't, for example, include the type of a control. in the accessibility label because the type is encoded in the accessibility traits. And VoiceOver also reads out the accessibility traits. So if you would call it create button, VoiceOver would read out create button, button. And this can get annoying pretty quickly, so don't include the traits in the type of the control in the accessibility label. There should also be no full stop in the end to help VoiceOver pronounce it correctly. And what's very important is that accessibility labels should be localized. It's in general very important to localize your app because not everyone is able to speak English or not everyone is able to speak Polish. So I'm pretty happy that conferences like this are in English, that people here, that menus are in English, that people are willing to talk in English with me because I can't speak Polish. So I think our apps should be the same. We should try to speak the language of the user. And it's even more important with accessibility because it doesn't help if you have the best and most concise accessibility labels if the users don't understand them. Speaking of localization, there's another property in this informal protocol on NSObject called accessibility language. Sometimes you have terms that you don't want to translate in every language. It might be, for example, a personal name or an app name. With accessibility language, you can specify the language of the text that gets read out to the user. So take, for example, iCloud Drive. You obviously probably want to pronounce this in English, so you can specify the accessibility language of English. If you don't do this, this is how it sounds like on a German device.
iCloud derive.
So this is literally how the app name of the iCloud Drive app is spoken out if you select it on the home screen. So we can do better here by specifying accessibility language. Sometimes, though, it's just not feasible to specify the language. Might be depending on your localization workflow that it's not possible to work with accessibility language. It might be that the string is part of a bigger string that's not easily decomposable. There are reasons why you can't specify it. So what else can we do? We can get a little bit creative here. And we can do something like this. This is how we translated iCloud Drive in our German app. And this is how it sounds like.
iCloud Drive.
So it's not perfect. It probably sounds a little bit like my accent, so it's okay for German users. They're used to this kind of accent. But it's definitely better than iCloud Drive. So if you use tricks like this, just make sure that you don't display this string somewhere on screen and only use it for accessibility and voiceover support, because otherwise it could confuse users a little bit. So there are lots of other properties like the accessibility traits, as I already mentioned, the frame, the path, etc. So you can make actually since this is an informal protocol on NSObject, you can actually make every object in your app an accessibility element, not just views and controls. And it might be, you might need that at certain points. If you want to take the whole thing one step further, UIAccessibilityCustomAction is a really great class because it can make all the difference between an accessible app and a really great to use app with accessibility and voiceover enabled. You can think of it as a context menu, right-click menu, long press menu, however you want to call it. So you can, with your accessibility custom actions, you can specify actions that the user can perform on your objects. Take, for example, a document picker with documents and folders in it, just as we have it in Finder on the Mac. You can specify actions to move a document, to delete a document, to rename a document there. And what VoiceOver does, it, as usual, speaks out the accessibility label first, then the hint and so forth, and then it has a slight pause, and then it says actions available. Swipe up or down to select a custom action. And then the user can simply swipe up or down and select an action and trigger it on your object. So that's a really great class to enhance accessibility support in your app. Another great thing about accessibility on iOS is the rotor. The rotor is a menu that's accessible everywhere by simply twisting your fingers on screen on an iOS device. So take, for example, the workflow of browsing the web. If we as sighted users browse the web, we don't read the whole web page from top to bottom. We actually usually skim it first. Like we're looking out for certain images, headlines, for links and stuff like this. And the rotor is what enables the same kind of workflow for visually impaired and blind users. So they can switch, for example, to links and then swipe up or down again to simply skim through all the links on the page. And new since iOS 10 is UIAccessibilityCustomRotor. So you can specify the same kind of workflow in your own app. So take the document picker example again, as we had before, with documents and folders on the same screen. You can, for example, specify a custom rotor which allows the user to simply go through all the folders on screen and skip the documents in between. And it makes them more efficient in using your app. All right, now it's time for a demo. So we added all these features to MindNode and felt pretty good about it until we actually sat down with the user and it was still kind of broken, most of the things, because if you sit down with an actual user watching them use your app, this is how you learn the most, because you'll learn about workflows that you didn't really think about. And it's so valuable if you have this chance, use it and sit down with someone who's actually visually impaired or blind and let them use your app. You'll learn so much about it. So let's see if the beamer works. All right, can you see? Yeah. So I'm going to turn on VoiceOver now with a triple click on the home button.
VoiceOver on. Landscape. Home button to the left. MindNode. Document sources. Button. Shows options to create or import documents.
So if you remember the video before, all these buttons were simply called button. So now we added real labels and hints to the controls so that the user actually knows what he can do with these controls.
Recently used documents. Mind maps. Heading. Document search. Button. Settings. Button. Add document. Button.
And we also added custom actions to this document picker. So if I go to the document MCE.
MCE 4. Button. Opens the document. Actions available.
It now said actions available. So now I can swipe up or down to go through all the custom actions.
Rename document. Move document.
And I'm going to move this document because it actually belongs into the folder conferences. So I can trigger that action with a double tap now.
Move. Move this document to a new folder. Conferences. Moves conferences. Document was moved. Mind maps. Document sources. Button.
So now we move.
Shows options to create or import documents.
OK, so now we move the document to a folder. And if we open another document.
Journaling with MindNode. Button. Select. Prompts. MindNode.
What it does, it instantly selects the main node, so you can simply start going through your document from here. And in MindNode, we always had this outline view.
Outline. Button. Select. Search titles. Search field. Double tap to edit.
Which actually is already a linear structure of the mind map and brings it into a linear structure. So we use the same kind of ordering on the canvas as well. So if the user skips through all the elements with a swipe left or right in sequential order, the same order is used as in the outline.
Selected. Out. Inspector. Prompts. MindNode. Review of the week. What was hard? What was good? What will I try differently next? What are the trends? Visioning. Level 1. Node 2.
And if you listen to this, it first says the title of the node, visioning, and then we also added some context information about the level and the index to give the user an idea about where on the mind map this node actually is. And we also have custom actions for the nodes here.
Family. Level 4. Node 1. Open task.
So it even adds information that there's a task attached to this node that's not completed yet. And we can complete that with a custom action by swiping up or down again.
Edit node title. Delete node. Add new child node. Add new sibling node. Complete task. Family. Level 4.
And
node 1. Completed task.
Complete a task in MindNode. All right, that's about it. That was a quick demo of
VoiceOver off.
accessibility support in MindNode for iOS now, and how it can look like if you actually add correct labels, hints, and other things like custom rotors and custom actions. So now we're going to come to my favorite part of the talk, because as I promised earlier, there's going to be time to play around with VoiceOver. So you can all take your iOS devices out again. Turn on VoiceOver not yet, but first go to the home screen and show Control Center with a simple swipe up from the bottom, and go to the first page of Control Center. And just make yourself familiar with the layout of the controls there, where which controls are. And then enable VoiceOver with a triple tap on your home button. And if you have done this, we're going to take it one step further. Now I want you to use 3 fingers and triple tap on the screen with 3 fingers. So don't freak out. If you succeeded, your screen should look like this now. It should be black now. What you just did is you turned on Screen Curtain, which is another feature of accessibility in iOS, because blind users obviously don't need the screen, so they can turn it off. It saves battery, and it's also for security, actually, so other people can see it either. So I have a challenge for you now. I want you to take a selfie. So I hope you all remember the gestures that we walked through before, like a single tap to focus on an element, swipe left or right to step through all the elements, double tap to activate a button, 2-finger double tap to trigger the most important action in an app. So what you should do now is start the camera app, switch to the selfie camera, and then take a picture. We're going to have a couple of minutes to try this.
Live photo, off, timer, off, filters, none, viewfinder, focus, camera mode, photo, photo and video viewer, but take picture, button, camera chooser, back facing, button, chooser, front facing, one face, large face, face near bottom, 0 faces. One face, large face, face near bottom right edge. 2 faces, one face, large face, face near bottom right edge. One face. One face, large face, face near bottom left edge. Screen curtain off. VoiceOver off.
So to everyone who succeeded already, I would like you, if you want to as well, to post them on Twitter with the conference hashtag MCE 2017 and Accessibility Challenge to make people aware of it. And I'd love to see some nice selfies up there. If you haven't succeeded yet, you can try it later and finish your selfie. So let's turn it off again. Hi, I'm a visually impaired user of Apple products, and I'm wondering if your app works with VoiceOver. Back in the day when Jessica wrote us this email, I was kind of puzzled. I was confused. I didn't really understand why she would want to use mind mapping as a visually impaired user. Nowadays, she's part of our beta testing team, and she helps us to improve accessibility support in MindNode. It's still not perfect. There's still lots of things we can improve on, but we're pretty happy with the result. And if a user writes us and asks us nowadays whether our app supports VoiceOver, we can happily answer yes. And to me, this is the power of making your app accessible. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? I actually have one question, if no one else has. Do you have some statistics? How many people on MindNode are actually using accessibility? Do you track that?
No, we don't. We actually don't track anything, or nearly anything, because user privacy is very important for us. So we don't have statistics on this. I can just tell you that we regularly have people writing us either on Twitter or support email and thanking us that we added accessibility support to our app. So people are definitely using it, but I can't tell you any exact numbers.
Okay, thank you.
How much time did you need to make your app fully accessible?
That very much depends on your app. So if you have in our case, it actually took us quite a while because of the nature of MindNode, because it's a visually focused app with especially the main task of mind mapping, a very custom UI. The rest was pretty easy. Like if you have a regular UI, it's pretty easy to make it accessible. The canvas was much more work to do. I don't know exactly anymore. It was like 3 or 4 pull requests with lots of commits in them. So it took us a while to make it fully accessible and to get to the state it is in now. But for most of the apps, it should be just a couple of hours, actually.
Hi.
Hi.
You had a good chance to work with someone that is visually impaired, but do you have some hints for other developers how to attract such people, like how to gather some insights about the applications? Because normally you do not plan usually the application for such usage. So. I wonder if there is some places when you can learn from visually impaired persons how to improve your application.
So what was the question about how to find people that can help you with this? Yeah, that's a tough one. I can't really tell you. I mean, you can use obvious channels like social media and actively ask for people. What we did is we teamed up with our university where I went to, and they know people from the Museum of the Blind in Vienna, and they connected us with the Museum of the Blind. So that's very helpful. Yeah, it really depends on where you're from, but you can use regular channels and just actively advocate that you're searching for people to help. There's also forums on the internet. If you come to me later, because I don't know it by heart now, there's one forum that actually actively tests apps for accessibility and voiceover support, and where we as developers can more or less ask for help. So just hit me up later, and I can search it, look it up for you. Yeah.
Does App Store make highlights of the apps for the accessibility on? For example, will your app will be higher in the ranks if it has accessibility on?
I don't know. I don't know about the internals. Unfortunately, it's still not visible in the App Store whether an app is actually accessible or not, which is I don't understand, and it's like a big disadvantage to me. Well, we had success with it in a way that Apple featured us afterwards. So that's what I mentioned in the beginning. They actively supporting developers that make their app accessible because it's important to them. But then at the same time, I don't understand why they don't make it easier for people to discover accessible apps. Yeah.
Hi. Today you talked about mainly voiceover and support for that, but do you have any tips for other kind of visual impaired people, like, I don't know, for example, cold blindness or something like that?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, there's a whole range of these technologies in iOS, and you can basically turn them on your device. Stuff like this happens, like the system helps you a lot with stuff like this. You can invert the colors if you're colorblind. Or, I mean, other than this, it's most of the time just basic rules, like just try to have enough contrast, make the font legible with certain font sizes and like this. So it really depends on which kind of disability you want to support. But especially on iOS, the system already does a lot for you out of the box if you use standard controls and standard UI.
Okay, so maybe more concrete. What was? Do you have any of those improvements implemented in your app also?
Yeah, for example, we have like the reduced transparency flag on, which does a lot also automatically, like reducing the blurriness and stuff like this. But we also have like custom transparency, and we changed this if this flag is on. Also reduced motion. So if the user has this flag on, we usually change to a simple crossfade transition instead of like making a full screen transition. So it's simple details like this, which you can very easily add in just a couple of minutes or hours, depending on the flag.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.